Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Pleasantville. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and Designated Pilot Examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic as always. This week we are going to record what I'm going to assume will be a very popular show, and that actually will be shows, because we're going to do a 2-part series starting today with a returning guest to the show, Pat Brown.
Hey, Bobby. Hey, Wally.
Hey. So, Pat Brown has been on the show at least 3 other times we are aware of. So it was at least his 4th appearance. We've done live shows together. We've done many different topics. And this topic, we're going to they're going to wear DPE hats today. Both Wally and Pat are DPEs in the greater Houston area. And they're busy as can be, like all the other DPs around the world. And they had a little break today because of bad weather. So we're going to knock out this show. And we're going to talk about common errors on check rides. In this first episode, we're going to talk a little bit about the preparation, the oral, and focus on private. And then when we reconvene next Monday, we'll talk about things that are more commercial, instrument, and some other topics that maybe keep happening on check rides for both Wally and Pat that they want to see stop happening. What made you think about, I mean, you sent the idea, Pat. I love the idea. What made you think about this? I'm going to assume a mistake on the check ride.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, what starts the idea for anything is if somebody screws something up, and I got to thinking one day a few weeks ago. I just see these things over and over and over, like you do, Wally, and over and over again. And to the point where I actually wrote a little document on common errors that's on my website for private and commercial. I haven't done the instrument yet, but it'll get there. Just hoping that some of these applicants that call me for check rides, they'll read it. And I mean, I can't fly the check ride for them. I can't teach in the airplane as much as we're at heart we're CFIs. We can't teach in the airplane. We have to observe, and it's when you have to sit there and watch something go off the rails. Boy, I tell you, it's tough. It's tough. So if we can kind of prepare them better for what happens just day after day after day that we see all the time, perhaps that will help some.
And just in case, we have people listening to us all over the world. What is that website that document's on?
It's www.houstondpe.com, houstondpe.com.
Awesome. So if you want to see that document and future documents, Pat has a lot of resources out there. Has all of the things he's ever participated in, I think, from podcasts to webinars.
Including these.
Including these. So feel free to go check out that website and grab that document as well. So as a flight school owner, and even today, I deal with a lot of these common errors as well, right? We were working on someone who was late this morning, someone who didn't have some things done this morning, who needed to be re-endorsed. It happens, right? We're not expecting necessary perfection, but we definitely want to reduce these common errors. And because today was all about preparation, let's start there. What are some of the big common errors that you guys both feel happen in the preparation phase? When I say preparation, I mean 24, 48 hours before they get to a check ride. What are applicants repetitively not doing right to set themselves up for that check ride?
Some of the things I see, and this is not new stuff. This is, if you go back and listen to previous podcasts, if my applicants would actually, it sounds like I'm going to be a little sarcastic, but if they'd actually read the letter that they get, about my check rides, they would understand it. They would fix this before it happens.
Is there an audible version of that? I'm just kidding.
No,
I'm kidding.
Not yet. But one thing I see a lot is logbook pages that are not signed. So if we've got entries in there and there's their cross country time, and until that page is signed, it's not a legal document. If I went and bought an item from somebody and gave them a check and didn't sign the check, I think before I walked out the door with whatever I bought, they would say, "Hey, you need to sign this check."
You could be dating yourself. I'm not sure too many.
Well, I know. I agree.
Sorry for that example,
But until that logbook it's just like the IACRA application. Until we go in there and electronically sign it, we haven't started. So I sit there for many minutes of my life. I've sat in the Checkride room while applicants go in and sign sometimes their entire logbook. And for a private, it's usually at most maybe 10 pages, so it's not a huge deal. Mm-hmm. But I see that. I also see just the inability to log into IACRA. And so that is something that I suggest is that you log into IACRA the day of the check ride, not the day before the check ride, but the day of the check ride, because at some point whatever the point is to where you have to change your IACRA password. I don't know how many days it is, but at some point it's gonna expire, and you're not going to be able to log in. And what I see is the applicant, the stress level in the applicant going up. Now I'm not upset about it. Yeah, it's going to take another 2 minutes, but I watch this applicant just start to sweat, and they're and then I have to be a psychologist and say, hey, it's okay, don't worry about it. We're going to get through this. Today, a young man came in for a check ride, a multi-engine check ride, and he had been endorsed. He actually pointed out in his logbook that he had 2 endorsements for the check ride because the first one was more than 60 days old. But guess what? They forgot to go in and do a new IACRA application. Mm-hmm. So when I went in to go get in, I couldn't even access the application. It won't even let us access. It'll say the recommending instructor's signature is more than 60 days old. So he had to go fill out an entirely new application, and he was again, I was being the babysitter saying, it's okay, it's all right, don't worry about it.
Another thing that'll happen on IACRA, and this is, I don't know how common this is, although I've had it happen 4 or 5 times, is when you have a discontinuance, and for whatever reason, perhaps the application was signed, some weeks ago, and of course it takes time to schedule our time, and now you have a discontinuance, and now you come back to finish the discontinuance, and now the signature is past 60 days old, and I don't know about you, Wally, but I typically don't look at the IACRA form before we do a discontinuance because it's kind of in a holding pattern for now.
Yeah.
And then you log into IACRA and see the big red letters that says the signature is over 60 days old. We can't process it anymore. So now it's a mad scramble to find the CFI because we got to do another IACRA so that we can finish the check ride out. So that's perhaps that's not a common error, but it happens enough that it's something that applicants should be aware of, that they've got a current enough IACRA form. The other thing too on I see you want to say something, but
I was just going to say, what I'm trying to sit in here as a student pilot, right? I'm a private applicant. If this has happened, I don't think in the old days when I did that, I would have thought that was my responsibility. I would have thought that was my flight instructor's responsibility. Now I own a flight school and a lot of CFIs work for me, and I'm sitting here thinking, the applicant really should know this. I think we've gotten to a point maybe where we've over-rotated. I don't know if it's society or not, but we've over-rotated, and I'm expecting someone else to solve all this for me or take care of all this.
This is the applicant's
I'm the pilot in command.
You're the PIC.
I need to know that I got 60 days.
Yeah. The other thing about IACRA is when you're signing in is 3 times and you're out. If you mess up 3 times in your password or your username, they lock you out. And now you've got to call the help desk, and they'll have to reset the password. And that could take anywhere between 20 seconds and 20 minutes to get the credentials to log back in again. So what I recommend oftentimes is, if you have an iPad or an iPhone or an Android device, and you've got IACRA on it, and you have IACRA, your password and username saved to that device, where you can just log in, it automatically populates like it does on mine, for example. Right. That eliminates a big problem, because oftentimes with iPads or any Android device, sometimes you have to drag, touch and drag in order to get the other character to populate or whatever. And if you don't do that quite right, well, all of a sudden now you've missed a login opportunity, and that's strike one. And so, and then what happens is exactly what you said, Wally. You can watch the stress levels just start to ratchet up and up and up and up.
And for some of you listening that are maybe going to take your first check ride, you think you've logged into iAccurate with your CFI and you've done this work. There's a requirement that in the room where you're meeting the DPE, you're going to log in and sign to say we're starting the check ride. So you have to, no matter what you think, you do have one more attempt that you have to log in that room with your designated pilot examiner.
And the other thing about, you mentioned about signing the logbooks, Wally, the other thing that I see really way more frequently than I should is that the logbooks are all written in pencil or totaled up in pencil. As you said, it's a legal document. So maybe you're signing the page in ink, but if everything is in pencil, that can still be changed.
I actually asked the FAA about that. Because I agree with you 1,000%, Pat. It ought to be in ink. But I asked my managing specialist about that, if it was a requirement, and he said there is no requirement for the totals to be in ink.
Interesting.
Which I think is really strange.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll say this:
really
I was taught to do it in pencil in case I made a mathematical error.
Well, that makes sense. But you can erase and replace in ink at the end of the.
We do sell green whiteout just in case everybody ever needed to.
Yeah.
I guess we sell green out, not green whiteout. Green out.
Green out.
It is a real thing, but very interesting for sure.
Well, I'm still going to make a mention to them that this is the legal document that really probably ought to be in ink.
I agree.
So we've talked about this, and I didn't have a chance to look up the numbers, but likelihood of passing or not being successful if I don't fly the week before. Like, what's the thought process there?
Yeah, there is some data on that, and I don't have it. I read an article from NAFI, which is the National Association of Flight Instructors, and they were able to determine, I want to say, I'm not even going to say what the numbers are, but it's significant.
How about we'll just say more likely?
Yeah. If you don't fly within a week of the check ride. And where I think we see this maybe is more with maybe discontinuances. You do the ground and the weather isn't cooperating, so you don't do the flight, and you say, okay, I can get you in 10 days, and then the applicant comes back. In fact, I just had one a few weeks ago, and it was an instrument discontinuance, I believe, and he seemed very, very rusty, and he passed, but it was a struggle. And I came in and I said, I'm just going to throw this out there. But I said, if I were a betting man, which I'm not, but if I were, I would bet that you have not touched an airplane since a week ago, since we did the ground 10 days ago. And he said, you're exactly right. And I said, well, instrument flying I say it's a very erodible skill. It erodes in a hurry, especially when you're inexperienced. And 40 hours of instrument time, in my opinion, is inexperienced. So you lose it in a hurry.
Yeah, no question. I don't think it's a requirement. I don't think it's something we would ever expect to see. But if you're not a good stick and rudder person, you probably should fly a few days before your check ride for sure. It's a pretty big day. Let's talk a little bit about the oral. What's some of the common errors, and not that I always miss weather theory questions, but what mistakes do applicants make? What common errors do they make in the oral?
Gosh,
the list is so long for Mr. Brown.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to answer that without necessarily saying when I ask this question, this is, or when I present this scenario. I mean, and not that any of this stuff is a real secret, because you know as well as I do that there's gouges on Wally, and there's gouges on me, and there's gouges on.
I might have seen one of those somewhere.
I'm sure you have. I'm sure. And the funny thing about it is oftentimes I can tell during the oral, which is okay, because at the end of the day, most of the time the busts occur in the flight, because they got to go fly. They might be able to study, every single question scenario that I'm going to do, or you, Wally, or anybody else, and have it down to the point where we're done with the oral in 45 minutes, and that's a real exaggeration. Right. But they still got to fly the airplane, so I don't care all that much about the gouges because I did it when I was
right.
a CFI. We all did
right.
it, but I really, for me, it's more about the actual preparation for the paperwork preparation. That, and as we talked about before we started recording, is answering more than was asked of you. Being uncomfortable with a silence after you've answered a question or completed your answer or what have you, and when the DPE stays quiet, it's like, well, he must be wanting me to talk more. So then all of a sudden they feel like they've got to expound on whatever that answer was. I remember when I was a CFI prepping a student for a private pilot checkride. This is a long time ago, and we were talking about airspace, and he was saying, Class Delta is this and that and beyond and blah, blah, blah. And he was absolutely right. And then he said, unlike Class Charlie, which is blah, 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 blah. And he was wrong. And I said, well, wait a minute. I didn't ask you anything about Class Charlie airspace. I asked you Class Delta. Why did you go on about Class Charlie? I say, what is the lesson we learned here? Mm-hmm. And he said, stop talking when I'm done. That's a good lesson. So
I don't think I was this foolish, but I felt like I had to impress the DPE. Right? And boy, how stupid really was I? Because someone told me that the DPE that did my private had like 24,000 hours, and I'm like, well, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of time in the grand scheme. I mean, I had no concept of what that meant, right? That you're not going to impress any of y'all, right? I mean, a private applicant isn't going to impress you with their book knowledge.
Well, let me talk about that just a little bit. I was doing we don't know everything. Wally and I will absolutely admit to anybody that will listen, we don't know all there is to know. That's a big misnomer. We know a lot, and I will grant you that. I don't say that in a boastful way. We know a lot. We've been flying a long time. Right. We probably know more than a private pilot, but we don't know everything. And oftentimes I have to go look for things because I don't know the answer. And in fact, I told you earlier before we started recording, Wally, afterwards I got to talk to you about a multi-engine thing because I don't know the answer to it. So we're going to talk about that. But I was doing an oral with an applicant some months back, and we were talking about TAFs and the duration of TAFs. And she said, well, usually they're 24 hours. They can be as little as 18, and she's absolutely right about that. And she said some of them are 30, and she's right about that too. And I said, yep, that's right. She says, but I found out that the 30-hour ones are done at airports that have international flights. Really? I didn't know that. And I've been flying for a long time, and I didn't realize that was the criteria for a 30-hour TAF.
No, I just learned something because I didn't know that either.
And you've been to a few of those airports.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And to a lot of them. Yeah. So we can and often do learn from applicants. When an applicant says something that I don't know, I'll usually make a note of it and go back because I don't necessarily want to challenge them on something that I can't go back and verify either.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think what I was trying to do was speak in such words and language that would impress the gentleman about my reading of the PHAC, right? Yeah. Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge.
In Shakespearean language.
That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And all you're going to do is dig yourself a bigger hole,
yeah.
right? You're going to go on about something that wasn't asked about.
Yeah.
And it's answer the question probably as
then shut
little
up.
as possible. Yeah. And then
well, the one I snicker at under not out loud, but I tell my applicant that everything that we talk about in this oral is going to be the context of this flight that we were taking. Okay, so I will say to them, okay, tell me, and I'm going to give away one of my secrets, but this is a question. I'll quit using it after this, but I will say, tell me what for this flight, and our flight is we're staying within the United States. Tell me what documents are required in the airplane. And they will start going through Aero. They'll say, I need an airworthiness certificate, registration, a radio license if we're going international, And
Doesn't that impress you?
And
though?
I
They
just
know
sit there and I think, well, we're not going international, but okay. For me, I would just leave that out because we're not going international. And probably most of these airplanes at these flight schools do not have a radio license. So,
You think?
So what's your follow-up question when they open that kimono?
well, sometimes I say, well, okay, well, tell me, since we're talking about radio license, what radios are required to be on the radio license?
Oops.
And then they kind of turn red. And the answer is every radio that transmits, which is your, obviously your comm, your transponder, and your ELT.
Yeah, we've had that conversation before.
Right.
Okay.
Any other things in the oral before we move on to the dreaded pre-flight?
Well, probably something will come up, but not that
If
I
you think
know.
of it, we'll talk about it. But let's talk pre-flight. So, okay, this is a moment where the applicant is on cloud nine. I feel like the first half is over. Everybody tell me if I got through the first half, that would be a good accomplishment. Now I'm going up and I'm getting dispatched. Whatever that looks like at the flight school, there's a lull where you're not around. Everybody's kind of looking at each other. Can I ask them, how's it going? The applicant walks back outside. They're going to pre-flight. I'm assuming you see common errors during the pre-flight. I hear of hour-long pre-flights to impress you as well. Talk to me a little bit about pre-flight common errors.
I'm not going to say this is so much an error, but regardless of what your checklist says, I would say the first thing is to go out there and check the fuel in the airplane. So if we need fuel, let's go ahead and make arrangements to get the fuel truck over, because I've watched these maybe not hour-long pre-flights, but I've watched these 30 to 45-minute pre-flights. Then they check the fuel and realize we don't have the required fuel. So then the phone call is made, and we wait another 30 to 45 minutes for the fuel truck to show up. So, let's check the consumable things that we can fix right now before we even move on to other things, and then then get in and get the checklist and start your pre-flight.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, has anybody ever left the plane tied down for y'all? I heard of a chalk. I heard of a chalk story recently with.
Oh, chocks, yes, but tied down, no. Not for me.
I just had a chalk story. Let's see, Saturday. Now, this young man had not started the airplane, but we were all strapped in. Luckily, it was in a Cessna 150, so he had his own door. I didn't have to get out, but I was actually in a multi-engine airplane where we started both engines, and we called ground, and we got a taxi clearance, and then he went, "Oh no!" So
that's the one I heard about.
Yeah, we had to tell ground that we weren't ready to taxi, and then, of course, I had to get out so he could get out. And,
Only one
again,
door.
the stress level. If we could have some measure of blood pressure or pulse or whatever, I see the stress going up, and then I become the nursemaid of saying, it's okay, it's all right.
That's happened to me before.
Yeah.
And we've all done it.
Yeah.
We've all done it.
We have.
I remember years ago in Brenham, this had nothing to do with the check ride, but years ago in Brenham, we were coming out for lunch, and there was a 421 on the ramp, and it had those big 747 style chocks on it, that you can't hop no matter what.
Right.
And the guy had started up his engines, and he must have realized that there was a chock. If I'll just hop it. So goes the throttles right that, and he collapsed the nose gear.
Oh.
And prop strikes and dug about a 3-inch trench in the concrete of the tarmac. And of course,
Can you say $100,000 mistake?
easily $100,000 mistake.
Oh, that no, a lot more than that. I would get. I mean, they're probably 2 3-bladed props.
Oh
plus
yes.
2
probably geared engines and
big.
and the nose gear. That was probably closer to $200,000 mistake right there. So that stuff can happen. On a pre-flight. And I don't know that this is really an error. I guess it goes along with the 45-minute pre-flight or something like that. But I want to see the applicant using a checklist. But for me, it's perfectly okay if they walk around and do their flow. I'm going to check this. I'm going to check that. They look at the ailerons and all the other stuff around there, and they got the checklist. But afterwards, okay, I check this, I check this, I check this, I check. Oh, I forgot that. And back up their flow with the checklist because they're using the checklist,
Right,
and which
yeah.
is the ACS requires the use of a checklist during
Yes.
a pre-flight. But for me, oftentimes looking at the checklist in a situation like that is you can't see the trees for the forest almost.
Right. Yep.
And so, if that's the right way to put it, the forest for the trees, either one, it's too micro. Let's get a bigger look, and then we'll double check line item by line item. And I'm fine with that.
And I think there's some confusion in the applicant world. Y'all aren't expecting them to have the plane reserved for the whole check ride.
No.
I think everybody wants that airworthiness certificate available and registration. Like pictures of that's fine.
Yep.
You're going to look at it again when you get to the plane.
Yep.
Somebody recently told me that they needed the plane for the whole ride. I think that's a common error from a standpoint of how you go about managing that expectation.
But here's the thing, though, is what if we have to refer to the POH, and the POH is flying in the airplane? You know, that's now if they've got a copy of it,
Sure.
If they've got a photocopy of it, if they got something on their phone, the relevant parts of the POH are usually going to be somewhere in the weight and balance area, usually, but not necessarily always. So, is there a like an office copy of a POH that they could refer to? Even if it's just a generic POH for a Cessna 172 for the purpose of just the oral portion.
That's what I was going to ask. Would a pilot information manual, which is a non-stamped POH, but fits that serial number, that would be good enough to review. You're wanting performance charts, I'm assuming, and that sort of information.
I think I can honestly say that I have never taken a check ride in an airplane ever that I did not have a personal copy of the POH, including my airline. I mean, obviously, airlines that were provided a copy of it. It's electronic, but I was just in my office the other day, and I saw my very first book was a Piper PA-38 112, a Piper Tomahawk. And when I walked in for my first flight lesson, the instructor had me buy two things. He had me buy a logbook, and he had me buy that manual for that airplane, and I still have it. I mean, that thing's really old.
Well, and we are talking common errors. I think one common error is that everyone thinks a 172 is a 172. If I downloaded a 172 POH, it's the POH. They're very much specific by serial number, avionics equipment, supplements. Many supplements could have been added, so be careful out there that you do have a POH, if it's electronic, that you downloaded, that it does meet the requirements for your aircraft, because it could be very far-fetched from what reality really is.
And what I'm going to be interested in, is a performance chart, for example. I mean, we might be talking about density altitude, and hey, it's 30 C outside today. How's that going to affect your performance? Why don't we run a quick performance evaluation on this hard surface runway with a 10 knot headwind or something like that. What's our takeoff run going to be? And I don't care if it's a generic manual for something like that, because I'm more interested that they understand how to do the calculation than do it for 30117.
Sure.
So, and same thing for the weight and balance. For the purpose of the oral. Now, of course, they have to run the weight and balance for us using the real numbers for the actual check ride. But in terms of a theoretical discussion about weight and balance, a generic POH for me is fine.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing I always ask is, I said, well, what true airspeed did you use in your flight planning? And they'll usually come up with a number, and I'll say, well, how did you get that? And sometimes I get, well, that's just what we use.
Yeah.
And I'll say, okay, well, let's figure out if it's really that number. But we're getting better on that. My applicants are getting word must be out, because now I'll get 109 knots.
Yeah.
I'll say, how'd you get that? And they pull out the chart, and I'll say, okay, well, it's 20 degrees, and we're at 6,500 feet, and 65% power. Okay, good. Very good.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So let's wet everyone's beak out there for part 2 a little bit and start talking about the plane has now started. We're moving. Is there any common errors with taxiing?
Oh, well, first of all, before we get moving,
Okay, here we go.
what about the passenger brief?
There you go. I would have failed my check route, I guess.
What about the passenger brief? And what are the elements required in the passenger brief? Because I've gotten in there and nobody's shown me how to shut the door. Nobody's shown me how to move the seat up and back. Nobody's shown me how to buckle the seat belt. Nobody's shown me how to open or close the window. And it's not all those errors in one particular check
Sure.
ride unless they just forget to give me a passenger briefing, which I had one do a couple of weeks ago. Totally forgot to do a passenger briefing. So I just sat there with my seat belt unbuckled and the door open when he started the engine. Aren't you going to buckle your seat belt? Well, you never told me how. Oh, and now you talk about the stress level. All of a
boy.
sudden, zoop, off the scale. So, passenger, and another one is the takeoff briefing. If we lose an engine, what are we going to do? I mean, that's kind of important. I tell them usually in the debrief. I said, so, when you're doing this takeoff briefing and you're flying with somebody that has never flown in an airplane before, it's probably not best to say out loud, if we lose an engine.
Right.
But you should be at least thinking that what's going to happen
Yep.
if something goes wrong. But for me, I want to hear what their thought process is out loud.
Probably a whole nother series, but the door made me think about common errors that I think CFIs make, and I've heard this, where maybe an applicant has never even closed the door on a Piper because
That
they've
could
flown
be.
nothing but dual instruction flights. They're all trying to get off and going, and you almost can't fault them for trying to be busy and go, but if the applicant's never reached over and closed the door themselves, I don't think y'all are going to close the door for them.
No.
So they have to at least practice that a couple times.
And
Keep that in mind.
I think as an instructor, a very good teaching point is to let them take off with the door open, to show them that the airplane actually flies just fine. Just turn around, come back, land, close it, and take off again.
Yeah.
You're good
Or
to
pop
go.
the door on the rotation.
Yeah. That's another thing, because all of a sudden it gets noisy. You feel a breeze. Yeah, it's not that big a deal, but if you're not ready for it, the stun factor could be a little bit overwhelming. Going back to the takeoff briefing, I guess what I like to see the applicant do is actually make sure that I'm understanding it, because a lot of times they have this rote thing that they just go through, and they use airplane terms. They said, like, we like to keep a sterile cockpit and blah 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 blah, and then they'll say, you have any questions? I said, well, I'm looking at this cockpit. It doesn't look very sterile to me. It looks filthy.
You must be flying at other flight schools. Then.
Yeah, absolutely. and they'll say, they give me kind of look. I go, what do you mean by sterile cockpit? They said, oh yeah, well, let's keep talking to a minimum. And I go, okay, I as the layperson, not a pilot, can understand that. So, you got to, when you give that briefing, you got to make sure, it's like playing catch. You got to make sure they catch it.
Right, for sure.
The other thing too, and this is probably slightly off topic, but when you mentioned the takeoff briefing on that, it's a rote thing. If we lose an engine on the runway, we're going to throttle back and exit the runway. If we lose the engine at 300 feet or 400 feet, and runway remaining, we're going to land on the remaining runway. If we lose the engine at 400 or 500 feet, we're going to look 30 degrees either side of the nose, and we're going to land out there trying to avoid hitting anything. If we're at 1,000 feet, what are we going to do? We're going to turn back to the airport. What?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe in a 172 or an Archer or something like that, you can make it back to the airport. But if you're in a Bonanza, or you're in an Arrow, or if you're in a Cirrus or something like that, that's probably a bad example because of the parachute. But the point is still the same. There is no way you're going to make it back to an airport at 1,000 feet in one of those types of airplanes. Yet we teach them to go through this stuff as rote. And we're setting them up to hurt themselves down the road when they start flying bigger airplanes. Because they're programmed from the word go. from the first flight, they're programmed at 1,000 feet. We're going to make it back to the airport.
Yeah.
Challenge yourself, find a simulator, and go try that a few times. If you can do it half the time in a 172, I'd be shocked. And that's that's you knowing that it's going to happen. Never mind the fear factor of not knowing.
If you take into account the oh my goodness factor, I'm cleaning that up a little bit for radio here. If you take into account the oh my goodness factor, you might be able to make that it's really more like a 270-degree turn by the time you line up with the runway, but you might be able to make that in 600 or 700 feet. If you know it's coming and you get really good at it, you in a 172, an Archer, that kind of stuff, you can likely make that turn back in a 400 to 500 feet. But that's knowing it's coming and practicing it, and nobody practices it, and nobody knows it's coming. So if you know it's coming and you practice it and you can get it down to, let's say, 500 feet, double that, because that's the reality. So that 1,000 feet, maybe.
Right. Maybe if the winds aren't shifting or crossing or whatever else.
And then which way is the wind? Which way is the wind? You got to turn into the wind.
Oh yeah, you got to make sure you don't make a mistake for sure.
So,
okay. Well, we're kind of 35 minutes. We probably should wrap this part up. We'll call this part 1. We still have a whole lot of Checkride left to do.
We hadn't gotten to the flight yet.
we haven't even got off the tarmac yet, but we'll get off the tarmac next week for sure. Share many more Common Airs. Hope you liked this episode. Welcome back, Pat. Next week we'll do the 5th or 6th or 7th visit for you. And until then, fly safely and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.